Hello everybody and welcome to our first edition of Torch Talks, where the Honors College sits down with our visiting scholars and innovators to dig a little bit deeper into their research and talk to them about what makes them tick. We're joined today by Ruut Veenhoven, Emeritus Professor of Social Conditions for Human Happiness at Erasmus University. He is considered a pioneer and world authority in the scientific study of human happiness, looked at as the subjective enjoyment of life. Thanks so much for being with us. So to get started, we want to go back to the very beginning. What inspired you to research human happiness?
Well, then we must go back to my student years, because I picked the student up in my study. And in my study I had a class in social philosophy, and I heard about the idea that we should aim at greater happiness for a greater number, and that this was an idea that popped up in the European Enlightenment. At the same time, in the 1960s, there was a new discussion going on. It was actually the first wave of the Limits to Growth movement, and progressive people agreed that we had enough wealth and that we now should aim at well-being. Well, then the question was, what is well-being? Well, one option is that people feel well, that they are happy, but the other option won, and they said, well, well-being is not what is produced by the market, but what you get from government. So, public goods, libraries, universities, streets, that is well-being, and the rest is market goods. And in the spirit of the 1960s, that was also filthy capitalism. Well, I wasn't convinced. I focused on the feeling part. What should we do that most people enjoy their life?
So that's kind of the evolution of where you started.
And if you want to inform policymakers about what to do to make that people enjoy their life, they need information, how much people like their life, and what conditions foster a positive enjoyment of life. And as such, happiness is not much different from health. We are now healthier than we were 100 years ago. Why? Well, one of the reasons is that we did a lot of research on health, and we found out that, people can get older than average at that time, that it's important to have eat vegetables, that sewer systems help to maintain health. Well, that information has been applied, and as a result we live now much longer than we did 100 years ago. Well, I think we can do the same with happiness. Gather information, feed it to the policymakers, and probably the next generations will not only live longer but also live happier.
So speaking of happiness, we of course have to define it. How do you define happiness?
It's life satisfaction. If you enjoy your life, you're happy.
And you've studied happiness in a number of different countries. What have you found when comparing country to country?
Well, then I see that there's big differences in happiness across countries. If you ask people to express their happiness on a scale from 1 to 10, then the average in Denmark is about 8, more than 8, and in several African countries it's about 3. So there is a big difference.
So what are the driving factors? Has your research pointed to any cause of why Denmark is so happy and why some of those African nations are not?
Yeah, well, of course, Denmark is rich and most African nations are poor. And in Denmark there's peace, and in a lot of African nations there's war. Well, that is pretty self-evident. But what was not so evident, and actually a surprise for me, is that the strongest predictor of how happy people live in a nation is the quality of the bureaucracy. Well, I had never associated happiness with bureaucracy, but yes, it is. In a country like Denmark has a very well organized civil service. The civil servants are well educated, they are not corrupt, and there's little difference between the rules and the practice. Whereas in a lot of African nations, well, they are failed states. Well, people enter the bureaucracy not because of their competence, but because of their relations. They are corrupt, and well, the rules on paper say little about what happens in practice.
Of course. There was also another surprise in your research when you looked at country by country, and that was income inequality not being a big factor.
Yeah, that was really a surprise, and in the beginning I thought I made a mistake. But yes, I did it over and again, and for instance, people are pretty happy in Latin American countries, such as Brazil, for instance. Well, there are huge income differences in Brazil, and well, and people are less happy in, for instance, well, say African countries where almost everybody is poor, but still pretty equal. I think the reason is that well, income inequality has both positive and negative effects on happiness. Well, the negative effect is rather obvious. In a country with big income inequality, for instance Brazil, a few people are very rich, they have big houses with a wall around it, and other people are poor and well, and they are probably envious. Negative. Yes, but on the other hand, if there are rich people in a country, there's also something like the American dream. Okay, this is something you could also get. This has been called the tunnel effect. You are at the beginning of the tunnel, but there is also an end. You could get there. You could become a millionaire. And well, when there are rich people, typically there's also a blossoming economy, and there's work, employment, and well, that's positive. And if you don't find the correlation, that means that the positive balance the negatives.
How about when we look internally at a country and the differences? What has your research shown?
Well, if you, for instance, look at the US, well, most people in the US are pretty happy. So the average is about 7.4. But yeah, some Americans are very happy, they score 9, and there's also a lot of Americans who are unhappy and score 5 or 4. And why is that? Well, some Americans well, are in a better position, have a better job, bigger houses. Yes, that makes a difference, but actually not very much. So in the case of the US, you can at best explain 5% of the difference in happiness with where people stand on the social ladder. Much more is in yourself. And whether you can make something from the living conditions in the US.
Expanding upon that, you argue that happiness can be engineered. We can do something about this. How?
Well, again, analogies with health. Of course, we can do something about health. Not everything. In the end, we all die. And how healthy you are is also well, a matter of genetics, good or bad genetic luck. Well, the same with happiness. But if we create better conditions, for instance, a better bureaucracy, well, then people get happier. And in the case of happiness, you can also learn how to make more of life. One of the things we can learn is social skills. Happiness depends very much on good relations, friendships, good sex. Well, that's things you can learn.
You also talk a lot about choices and how freedom makes us happier. Is there anything that governments and institutions and schools can do to enhance that?
Governments better not tell us what we should choose, but governments can help us to make more informed choices. And one of the ways governments can do that is stimulate research on, what happens to the happiness of people who made particular choices. Let me give an example. Should you take early retirement if that is financially possible? Well, some people would say, do it. But it could be that you're bored to death if you do it. And so people wonder, what would be a good choice for me? Well, if you follow people who took early retirement, how happy they were before, how happy they were after, and you follow also people who continue working until 80 maybe, and then you can figure out what kind of people profit if they retire early and what kind of people profit if they keep working as long as possible. Well, and you can feed the population with this information. Just like we did in health, we found out that jogging, for instance, is good for some people, not for everybody. Okay, we have that information, when people use it, they make more informed choice, and then on average the result is better.
So lay the information on the table. You also advocate for professionalizing life coaching. We live in a multiple choice society, and it means that we have to make choices. What job should we take? We could get a thrilling job abroad. Should we do that? Am I the right person? We have pretty limited information, so it's good to have a professional to help you. And there are professionals by now, but not every professional who says is a life coach is equally professional. So you and I can just say today, I'm a life coach. Come here. The life coaching business is a bit in the stage where medical doctors were 200 years ago. And I think that, if this becomes really a profession, if they learn coaching skills, but if there's also good follow-up research on what actually happens to people, for instance, who become an expat, and life coaches know that information, then a lot of people will get a bit happier, and we have a new profession, and these professionals will pay tax, and the tax revenue will return the investment. Another piece of the puzzle you frequently talk about is increasing investment in mental health. How does that help happiness?
A bit like that investment in somatic health made us live longer, and investment in mental health, will cure depressions and anxiety. These exist, just as we get a common cold and all kind of diseases, somatic diseases. They are mental diseases, and the better you treat them, the less you have them, and the happier people are. And that's what we can really see when we compare countries. And the countries that invest most in mental health, that say have more psychiatrists and psychologists per capita, well, in these countries people are happier. Even if you take into account that typically the more rich countries have more psychologists.
We didn't really talk about how you accomplished your research. Can you describe a little bit of some of your research methodology?
Well, my main methodology is gathering the results of other people. Okay. In the field, well, a lot of people do their own studies and they publish, and ever more researchers publish about happiness. So I think this year more than 500 research publications on happiness will appear. Well, the higher the pile, the more difficult it is to oversee the results. And the greater the chance that there is a lot of double work being done. So what I do is I gather these results and put them in what I call a findings archive. And so I read all the papers and then I take out the findings. Findings are described in a standard terminology, also in a standard language, English, and they are put in a database.
And that's the World Database of Happiness?
That is the World Database of Happiness, which is free available for mankind.
Okay. So when you first began researching happiness, did you encounter any challenges or resistance? Because it is a unique line of research.
There was a lot of resistance, and anyway, I didn't get any funding. Most of my paid career, I didn't get any funding.
Why was that? Were people hesitant to invest in happiness or skeptical?
They were skeptical, and and a lot. There is also a lot of resistance from people who think that they already know what will make people happy, and don't want to be disturbed by real data. And for instance, in the case of income inequality, there is a strong political movement. They say, well-being, that is equality. And the more equal, the better we are. And when you tell, but I didn't find any correlation between happiness and income inequality, then you're not really welcome anymore.
What are the next steps for you in terms of your research? What do you want to look at next?
I want to continue with the World Database of Happiness, because I think now that the research is really growing, we ever more need such a tool to bring it together and to keep an overview. But another project I'm running is the so-called happiness indicator. That is the combination of a self-help tool and a long-term follow-up study in which people can record how happy they are, but they can also compare with the happiness of people like them who also participate in the study. And for instance, if you wonder, could I be happier? Say on a scale from 1 to 10 you score 7. Could it be an 8? Or am I exceptionally lucky that I score 7? Well, if you join the happiness indicator, and then you get an email, how are you? You fill in, last month I felt 7. Then you have also entered your age, education, sex and income, and the computer compares other people. Well, we have more than 100,000 participants by now, the people who are like you, and suppose these people on average score 8. Well, that means that it could be better.
Do better.
But suppose that people like you score on average 6, then you may be, at your highest.
Does participating in the happiness indicator yield any results? Do you see any changes from people by participating?
Yes, we just did a follow-up study. The project runs now for a couple of years, and people who participate over some time, and they got happier a bit.
Okay. We have to ask, do you consider yourself a happy person?
I've a diplomatic response. I'm like the average person in the Netherlands, which is about 7.8.
Fairly good. Well, is there anything that we didn't cover yet that you think is important for people to know about your research and your work?
Yeah, well, I think that if you think you can get a bit happier, you want to be happier, join the happiness indicator. It is on internet, happinessindicator.com.